You should already know who he is without even looking at the banner behind him. Sam Gore, all part of the ESPN family of networks. He is what I like to call the Novak Djokovic of sportscasting because he, to take a tennis term, is like that all-court player. He can basically call any sport. It's tennis, it is volleyball, it is basketball, it is gymnastics. We can continue to go on here. And this is an opportunity to showcase him and look at what makes him inspirational. I'm Bryan Fenley, a national anchor at Fox Sports Radio. I also do some volleyball for ESPN Plus and some tennis on the challenger level. So for me, this is really a fun treat because this is somebody in Sam who I really admire. I've had a couple of his colleagues on and they say, hey, why isn't Sam on? Finally, we get the opportunity. So Sam, I'm grateful to have you. Of course, you can follow Sam on Twitter at Sam B. Gore. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. I wanted to start here, Sam. How has being a dad made you better at your job?
Well, I think that being a dad, first of all, forces you to make decisions about what you prioritize. And so when you have a child, you really learn the art of self-sacrifice and unconditional love. You start to see things in a little bit better perspective than you maybe typically would. I hear that a lot from coaches when they have children. All of a sudden, their sport is put into a different perspective. So I think that becoming a dad really helped me have a better perspective on where work should fit into your life and where family should fit in and how you merge those two together.
As a broadcaster, oftentimes what we see, and we're supposed to be that impartial person, but then there's the emotion. And sometimes being a broadcaster and the emotion merge, as you said. And then there's the dad element. And I want to ask you how that played into when you called the finals NCAA team action in Orlando, and you called that moment probably one of the most rewarding experiences of your career, where it was Ben Shelton, if I'm not mistaken, wins that clinching point. His dad is the coach. They win the title. Not only are you calling that, but you are a dad. So how did being a father intensify your emotions, soaking in that really neat experience?
Oh, Bryan, I was an absolute wreck when that happened. I mean, it took every bit of self-discipline I had to be able to speak. And honestly, when moments like that happen, you almost have to go into being an actor, because all of a sudden you have to tell yourself in a split second, you are there portraying a role. You're the voice of this event. You're documenting it for generations to come. And so any of your personal emotions that would not be appropriate or would keep you from delivering the message have to be subdued. But I have to admit, I got through it on the air because I was just so caught up in telling people what I was, or describing what I was seeing and trying to record that historical moment. But after the fact, it took me a while to really talk about it without getting emotional. I mean, it was literally just something that if you were writing a script, that would be the ending. It was a made-for-movie event happening right in front of my eyes. And also just the added depth that you mentioned, not just that Ben Shelton won the NCAA title for his dad and for Florida, but the Shelton family. Oh my gosh, they are just such high integrity, high character people. I can honestly say you would never find anyone in our business or in the world of tennis that would have anything but good things to say about Bryan Shelton and his wife and their boys. So just knowing what it had to mean to them, the fact that something good was happening to a good person, it was tough to talk about after the fact.
Speaking of good things happening to good people, I think you would fit the category of being a good person. And Sam, you've talked about how growing up was a challenge because, you didn't always get that fatherly support that you were hoping for. And for me, I share a similarity with you. In fact, when I was a teenager, I actually lost my dad to cancer. So having that really strong female motherly role of nurturing is sort of what I was leaning to, and I know for you as well.
Yeah.
How much for you in your drive and your pursuit as a sportscaster is trying to seek a validation that maybe your dad wasn't able to provide for you, but that is part of your fuel in what you do?
I've never sought validation along those lines. Fortunately for me, now my dad has passed away, and for the last several years of his life, he was a completely different person, and we were very close when he passed away. But growing up, it was a pretty rough childhood for between my parents. However, for some reason, this gets back to me and my personal faith. I, at a pretty young age, started, investigating who God was and who Jesus was, and not in a political way or not in a judgmental way, but just what is God like as a father? What are Jesus's teachings? And I grasped on to that relationship when I was younger, and so God kind of navigated me through those tough times. Sometimes you'll talk to people that had a rough childhood with their dad, and you'll talk to them about a faith in God, whether you're a Christian or Jewish or whatever, and they don't want any part of it because of that father issue. And for me, I was able to, through my own search of the scriptures, through my own investigation of what a father should be, I never associated my dad and God as the same. I knew that my dad was a human being just like me, with flaws and weaknesses, and had a need for forgiveness and grace, but that God was a perfect father. And so I kept my eyes on him as I moved through adolescence and into adulthood.
Sam Gore is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. You talk about the teachings and your faith, and I see how that has rubbed off on you, because I see in your work and the way you carry yourself, Sam, with such selflessness. In a business where ego seems to be permeating all over the place, I don't see that from you. Why is that?
Well, I think it does get back to my belief system. I'm not a martyr, but one of the things Jesus teaches constantly is to deny yourself and to put others before you, to be humble and to be gracious, not to be weak, and not certainly to devalue yourself, but to just have a healthy perspective of who you are as a human being on this earth. And so for me, Bryan, I'm just in a constant state of thankfulness. I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to work in the profession that I always dreamed of. And I never have taken it for granted. It's just been with me, that spirit of thankfulness. And I think it would have to get back to just my personal belief system, knowing that, I can wake up tomorrow and maybe I'd have to be moving in a different direction. So how do you handle that? I think that when you're in a blessing situation of having your dream job, the interesting thing about that is to never make it define you, to never allow it to be who you are. And so every day, literally every day, I wake up and say, if you lost your position at ESPN tomorrow, could you carry on? And every day I'm able to say yes, because I know that as much as I love my job and as much as I love ESPN and the people I work for, I have this father that is going to provide for me, maybe when the world isn't. So, but I don't want that to happen, obviously. But I do think that when you reach certain goals and successes, you have to test yourself as to whether you could let it go if you had to. And I think the most balanced, well-rounded people are able to say, yes, I could move on and be okay regardless of what I'm doing.
Having the wife that you have in Julie, and you think about whatever adversity and the way in which you've reached this mindset where there's such a self-centered approach, where it's like you're not self-centered, but you're centered. I guess I should say. Yeah, which is much different. So let me make sure I make that
That's
clear.
okay. I've been called worse.
I know, no. You are centered internally. How about that? Instead of self-centered, centered internally. But on top of that, having your wife, Julie, and how has she been your rock through this journey of yours?
It's interesting. We moved to Florida, and before we moved, Julie, she has her master's degree in social work. Well, she worked for hospice. So she was an in-home hospice social worker, which basically means she's going into the homes of those who are dying every day. And as the social worker, she was helping the families get through it and make plans. And she would obviously be dealing with the patient as well and the relationships. The stories that she would have from just her average day of work were more than most people could ever handle one time in their life. And I think that just seeing what Julie was dealing with on a daily basis, and that was her world that she was living in, it certainly put, whether I have my headset on and the cables in the way, in perspective. I mean, there's just problems that we have at work in broadcasting that were just like not even on the radar of what she was dealing with, and just seeing her navigate that area of life that very few people even want to talk about, and her embracing it and being such a blessing to these families. When she would come home from work, I just felt so humbled, like what can I possibly say about, me being on television that would compare to what she was dealing with on a daily basis. So honestly, Bryan, I kind of struggle with that. Like, am I in a profession that means anything for a while? And she put that to bed right away when I kind of told her that I look at her day, I look at my day, and I'm like, well, is what I'm doing really meaningful? Because I want to have an impact. I want to help. And she said, honey, let me tell you this. Whenever I walk into a patient's bedroom, someone who's dying, or when I go into that hospice care center and I enter that room, she said, I can't tell you the number of times those dying patients have ESPN on their television. You are providing them with an escape from what they're dealing with. They are in the process of dying. They are in pain. There's grieving, there's mourning. And you're the voice that is giving them something to be inspired by, giving them something to escape from what they're dealing with at that moment. And ever since she said that, I mean, that was like another perspective growth for me to now, as I'm announcing an event, going to every event with, what would someone laying in that bed want to know right now? How can I inspire them? Or how could I, make that athlete's family proud by what I'm going to tell the audience about them? I'm more of a storyteller in the way I approach my events. I want people to be inspired by what they're watching and not pile on and add to controversy that may be happening.
You have all of these elements of your life in the background, which to be inspired from. And that's such a fascinating, captivating, heartwarming piece to what you do, in the fact that so many people look to you for inspiration as well, because you are, knowing your selflessness, Sam, you're all about showing the stories of others and showcasing what they do that's inspirational. But you also have those inspirational qualities, and that have been out there. And I know, as someone as humble as you are, you don't go to them as much. But if you were to have a level of pride, if you're allowed to give yourself that moment, where does your mind go to?
That's a good question. I feel like that I'm certainly, I do know that I seem to have the ability to capture a moment in a very succinct, impactful way. And the words just come to me maybe easier than they would another person that doesn't do this. And so I love the fact that I can see something and describe it in a way that other people get it or they're inspired by it. So that's sort of an ability that I feel like I have had since I was a kid. But then again, the guy who comes over and fixes my broken sink is inspiring to me because I couldn't possibly do that. I couldn't, hook up the Wi-Fi in this room that I'm in. So I think that we all have gifts and areas that we get to share with the world. It's just some seem to be recognized as more important than others, unfortunately. But I would say my ability to just take a moment and say it in a way that inspires someone watching is something that I'm happy to be able to do.
Somebody who's looking for some inspiration when it comes to working out, they can look to you as well. Evidence from what I see behind you in that Peloton, which I know, Sam, gets a whole lot of work done, considering how rigorous you are with your workouts. You've made that such a fundamental part of who you are. When you're training, when you're grinding away on the pedals, where does your mind go?
It's interesting, Brian, because I've never been a person that had to get motivated to work out. And I live in a home where no one else is that way. I work in a world where I will deal with the professional athletes that are the analysts, and they're like, oh my gosh, why are you still working out like this? Or, you don't have to. I quit doing that when somebody quit making me. And the interesting thing about that, Brian, is I've always liked it. I don't expect anyone else to. I don't hold anyone to the same standards that I hold myself to when it comes to exercise and working out. But when you mention where does your mind go, that again is key to understanding me. I tell people that there are two places where I've had my most profound moments: in an airplane and while I'm working out. And it just seems like as I work out, my mind and my spirit are just more receptive to ideas and thoughts. And so for me, working out, it's not necessarily a release, but I'm not only growing physically, but my mind just seems to work so well when I am working out. A lot of times ideas I'll get for our show open, or scripts that I have to write for a show I'm working on, or prep questions I want to ask someone, they will come from me when I'm back here on this bike or in the weight room. I don't know why, but I also feel like that's part of the neat thing about what keeps me and my desire to work out.
I would think working out too enables you more creativity in the broadcasts. Like, you might think about a certain way something happens, and your mind will say, well, I can say it that way, or wait a minute, how about I change up the phraseology and say it that way? So it's like, how can you say a certain play, how a certain point, say in volleyball or tennis, worked itself out? And you're thinking of multiple ways to call it. At least that's what I envision when I think of you. And when it comes to volleyball, you're working on ESPN family of networks, all of them, and SEC Network, of course, ACC Network. With the ACC Network, that is one of the newest ventures. And so how cool has it been for you to dive into that conference, considering you went to North Carolina? And so when the higher ups like Amy Rosenfeld and everybody said, Sam, we need you to do ACC volleyball, what was your reaction?
Well, it's actually the other way around, Brian. I was the one saying, Amy, Stephanie Drewley, Maria Suarez, Pat Lowry, anyone. I am an ACC guy. Please let me do ACC sports. And so I was jumping up and down asking. And then fortunately, it worked out to where I do a lot. But you're right, Brian. And you went to UNC Greensboro, so you understand a little bit of that. A lot of my friends in New England and in other parts of the country, they're obsessed with professional sports. But I know it's this way in Big Ten and Pac-12 to a certain extent. But when you come into the South and you're basically from Virginia down and over to Texas, it is college sports. And in a way, it's really hard to explain to people that haven't experienced. It's a culture. It's unfortunately, too many people base their self-worth on how their school is doing. But when my friends from Europe that I work with in tennis, they're like, why are all the Americans running in this tiny trailer filling out a basketball bracket? I mean, so, but growing up in North Carolina like I did, I was part of the era that from first grade through 12th grade, the ACC tournament, when I was younger, there were only 8 teams in the ACC. So your quarterfinals were Friday, semis were Saturday, championship was Sunday. So Friday at noon, every teacher in the school had access to a television. They would wheel that TV on the cart, and there was no more school the rest of the day. Everyone from elementary schools through high schools watched the ACC tournament until it was time to go home. And then you get home and everyone in the family would watch the ACC tournament. The worst part about it was when they had the 2-hour break between the afternoon session and the evening session, because you missed it. You wanted it to just keep going. So college sports, and specifically the ACC, were so much a part of my personal life growing up, my heritage, just part of the fabric of the environment I grew up in, that when we did the ACC when we started running the ACC network, it was something that I just was passionate about getting involved in, because also I've had such a great experience with the SEC network as well. And those two conferences are very symmetrical and related. Who knows, they may all be one conference before it's all over. But it's so it was really nice for me to get started in the SEC network and establish a lot of fantastic relationships there, and then also absorb the ACC network when it became available.
Sam Gore is with us, ESPN and Tennis Channel. I'm Bryan Fenley. Sam, living out on the West Coast for now, I've lived in other parts of the country and of course North Carolina, but when I say where I went to school, most people say, oh, did you go to Chapel Hill? I said, no, there's more than one UNC in North Carolina. And I said, yeah, I went to UNC.
Wait, you're treading on thin ice here, brother.
This is a cool story, Sam. So when I was a student at UNC Greensboro, I went to a basketball game in Cameron Indoor, which I'm sure you've done. And it's a bucket list for everybody. But yeah, exactly.
Just kidding.
Yeah, of course. But so I was there. My alma mater was playing UNCG Duke, and obviously Duke would win. But I remember the student section, the Cameron Crazies, and one of the shouts in unison, and they said UNC GED, and they did that like geez, here's the difference between your school and mine. They wouldn't be saying that for the Tar Heels, but for me they would. I thought it was so funny. So. But
actually, it would be a lot nastier.
Oh, that's true.
So consider yourself lucky.
At least
they were only insulting your intelligence. They didn't yes. go to your family and all the generations of those before you. So
yes, I want to leave you with this, Sam. My final question. Sam Gore is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. Somebody who has been at the core of your growth in this business is Cliff Drysdale, and when those who have made it, people reach out to them. Some can be discouraging. Some can say, I don't know about that, but Cliff was so encouraging for you, Sam. And I wonder how much the career that you have put together was because of those early encouraging words from Cliff, and how he has been on team Sam Gore from close to the start.
Yeah, for those who don't know what you're alluding to, I lived in Wilmington, North Carolina for years, and Cliff developed the club that I was in the neighborhood that I lived and that I was a member of. It was called Landfall in Wilmington, and Cliff designed the tennis center, and for a long time he staffed the club. His company did. He was a resident there, and then there was another man just as influential, Bob Rosberg, who was at the time ESPN's director, the guy who's directing the shows, as well as the son of the great golfer, Bob Rosberg. So with those two men living within my neighborhood, it sort of made my dreams seem more possible, because I could touch those guys. I could see those guys. They were where I wanted to be. Not, they weren't announcers. Well, Cliff was an announcer, but they were in the world that I wanted to be in. And they were never anything but encouraging to me. With Cliffy, Cliffy is one of the funniest people I know. And usually he comes off as bragging and grandiose, but it's all, you know, it's all for fun. Cliff Drysdale is one of the kindest, gentlest human beings I've ever met. In fact, he was very close to one of my children. He would play games with him when he was little, and David, our son, David. And so he's just a great guy. So he knew what I was trying to do, and he knew how far away I was from it. And he just continued to encourage me. This is way before ESPN, when I was in the insurance business calling UNCW basketball games. And so anything Cliff did locally, he ran a Legends event where he would bring back great players from the past. He would make sure that I was announcing it on the local ABC affiliate. He would do a deal with the ABC affiliate and I would announce it. So there were these little breadcrumbs dropped along the path by Cliff and Rossi. And then Rossi was actually the person who gave me my first shot in professional tennis. And then that led to me, long story short, ending up in ESPN International. And at that point, Cliff would come to Bristol to do some of the domestic shows. I would be there doing the international shows. And we would go to dinner and he would just encourage me, and he would, you know, offer words of advice. And he was kind of my sounding board. But there's just enough can't be said about how when you're around someone who's doing what you want to do, for some reason, at least for me, it made me feel like it was achievable and attainable, especially when they were so encouraging. But I mean, Cliff Drysdale was a mountainous presence in my career, more than he probably even realizes. But, you know, I was on a call with him yesterday, and it's amazing when Cliff speaks, it's like, okay, we don't need to hear anything else. You know, he sits back and he listens, and he just states a lot of times what is actually the most obvious thing that should be said. And he's like now the words of wisdom on our ESPN announcer team. But yeah, Cliff was still very special to me.
Fun to see how he has facilitated and helped you believe in yourself and encouraged you along the way. And I do see a lot of Cliff attributes in you, Sam.
I'm not as good looking as Cliff.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that.
He's got the accent, the look. The guy's still probably grinding out an hour on the Stairmaster every day and lifting weights. And he's, you know, I'm not in Cliff's league.
Well, you are always going to look back at him as someone who has been so instrumental to your career, and that gratitude is really the common denominator of this conversation and what Sam is all about and why he is someone we should all admire. Sam Gore, Bryan Fenley, thank you so much for some of your time here and telling us about your story. And this was really a lot of fun.
Thank you, Bryan. Anytime.